Hello everyone, today we talk about the campaign of Pylos and Sphacteria in 425 BC. So, as some of you have probably noticed, I began from some time to make every once in a while now videos about classical military history, and more specifically about the Persian Wars. Now, I think this is the first video on the Peloponnesian War actually, and I plan to expand in the future, yet albeit very progressively on this topic. Now, the campaign of Pylos and Sphacteria is probably one of the most important, and probably is definitely one of the most important episodes of the Peloponnesian War. Today I would try to maintain the the historical background to a minimal, because I would like to carry out an analysis of the whole campaign. It is pretty long. It entails these two major, encounter. The campaign lasted essentially 3 months, even more. So it's pretty long, and there are lots of things to say. Pylos and Sphacteria are named in this campaign because they were the site of the major engagements that took place between, in fact, the Athenians and the Spartans at this point. So I recently, in previous days, I also stopped making other videos about military history because I was preparing this, which is pretty long. So I would just like to get pretty much straight to the point. And this is gonna be a kind of not maybe a strictly cold and strategical and tactical analysis of the campaign and the various engagements, but I've done something similar with the first Persian invasion of Greece. If you're interested to go look at, that's a pretty much more of a strategical look. Today we're gonna take a look at both, that is the strategical let's say evolution of the campaign and the tactical analysis of the battles. They're not excruciatingly difficult to understand because they were not pitched battles, as a matter of fact, but there is still much to understand tactically speaking, which makes this episode of the Peloponnesian War extremely interesting, because it basically shows with the Spartan defeat at the hands of the Athenian Psiloi, that we'll see these were skirmishers, essentially extremely light infantry. This marks essentially, I think, if I remember correctly, this is actually the first major defeat of hoplites, actually, and the best hoplites around at the time that were the ones of Sparta, by the hands of these lighter troops. Being used by the same Greeks. Because it's obvious that there were other engagements into which, say, the hoplites had difficulties to cope with other, let's say, barbarian tactics, as they called them. This is a moment, the Peloponnesian War is a moment of evolution of classical hoplitic tactics towards something different. I will hopefully spend a lot of time to explain this on Schwerpunkt in the future, because I'm personally very interested about this transformation from, let's say, classical Hellenic to essentially Hellenistic warfare. And I'm actually more passionate about Hellenistic warfare as such, but it's very, very important to understand also why Hellenistic warfare and where this Hellenistic warfare emerged from. And the Peloponnesian War is this moment in which certain things were beginning to take place. So, giving a minimal background, that the war basically originated as a conflict between Sparta and Athens as the main powers of Greece, that, however, were developing at this point very different. They were similar under certain points by certain standards. Definitely, these were two Greek polis. They had their own very peculiar military traditions that were can say purely, at least initially, classical Hellenic ones, that, however, are also very difficult to frame, because if you ask me which is an hoplitic battle that basically stuck to those essential, perfect, unaltered hoplitic models, I would have difficulties to express it, because every battle always had kind of something more, something added to it. I think I made, if you go into the Ancient Warfare playlist, I made some month ago a video on exactly on the Psiloi, actually in the Hellenistic period, not in this previous classical Hellenic times. which deal a little bit also with partly with these problems. I can give you the title. It is I've done something on classical Hellenic slingers that takes into consideration also that thing, but also something on Hellenistic light infantry, the Psiloi or Gymnetes. So if this might these two videos might give you a bit of background relatively to something we will see now with in the campaign of Pylos and Sphacteria. I don't remember the point I was making. Oh yeah, well, the two main powers of Greece. Surely Athens, basically after the Persian Wars, had developed this thalassocratic power that is essentially transforming his former League of Allies in the Aegean Sea into practically an empire, from which Athens basically dominated the seas and the sea traffics, etc. And therefore becoming more of a maritime power, and Sparta instead maintaining, despite, as we will see today, having also naval force, etc., maintaining a predominantly terrestrial character as a political and military power, relying chiefly on these land allies, and being inferior to Athens at sea, but superior on land, as the Spartan hoplites at this time were definitely the best that Greece had to offer, and also they, essentially up to Hellenistic times, they would at least up to the Battle of Leuctra, let's say, that really opens to many to the gestation, we can say, of the eventually of the Hellenistic tactics. They maintain the highest hoplitic standards. So now we don't have much time to explain what the hoplitic warfare really was. I will definitely discuss it in the future. However, I think most of you are acquainted with the essentials of this. The hoplitic tactics entailed essentially these thickly packed formations of spearmen, in origin pretty heavily armored, and at this time having this also very large shield that could protect all the side and say the front, mostly because these hoplitic tactics were conceived to essentially go straight at the enemy, not really performing complicated maneuvers, because simply the Hellenic hoplites, with the only exception of the Spartans that confirms the rule, were not trained enough to maintain cohesion. Sometimes it happened by chance. I talked about recently about the Battle of Marathon, that obviously was an amazing feat of the Athenians in this sense, but let's say that complex maneuvers were proper just of the Spartans, and that's what the Spartans actually were mostly about. Spartans were not strong because they were individual fighters. It is true the Spartans were also better trained individually than the other hoplites, Greek hoplites, and we'll see today that this kind of came to use, but not really to reverse the result of the Battle of Sphacteria. But their main efficacy was based on the fact that they carried out maneuvers, so they deployed in battle formations, stuck together with much more cohesion than all the other Greeks, and that was the effectiveness. It was not a matter of individual skill; it was a matter of collective training that these Spartans really carried out for all their lives, and that's what their existence was really about. So that's why they were so effective. So actually, the Peloponnesian War is marked by this constant Athenian maritime expansion that was trying to be countered by a Spartan terrestrial expansion that launched periodically every year, almost the attacks in Attica, but failing eventually to seize Athens because chiefly of the Piraeus. So this wall that connected essentially Athens to its port, and therefore Athens could not be besieged by the Spartans because it could be continuously supplied by land, and taking these fortifications was really too much. So much of the Peloponnesian War was marked by this also strategical balance, if you want. So this is more or less the frame. We're not gonna go much more in detail now. We'll just pass to really the campaign for the way it was. So essentially, the campaign of Pylos and Sphacteria began with complete different expectations with the ones that compared to the ones that would eventually the fact the developments that would eventually emerge. Essentially, the Athenians were dispatching a military expedition to aid their Sicilian allies against the growing power of Syracuse. That was this main center of southeastern Sicily, was eventually trying to expand into the whole island, and also to give some aid to the Corcyraeans that at the time were essentially there was democratic regime was being threatened by certain the aristocratic faction that had essentially that was carrying out guerrilla warfare into the island of Corcyra, in fact, and putting them into trouble. But the Athenian politics at this time was a bit messy. Was as a democratic regime that was a bit of the exasperation of this form. Had sometimes a pretty chaotic, decision making. Also in terms of military affairs, Athens had these huge resources that were invested into military affairs, but sometimes this city was so well off that it grew. Maybe it could afford to grow, say, competitive towards their own generals sometimes, so that to punish them if they did something wrong, but at least letting them do what the political mandate was hoping to achieve. And this expedition had been mounted up at the command essentially of Demosthenes, and that is considered one of the best generals, one of the best Athenian generals of the time. Now we're not gonna go through the records of this, and I'm sorry about it because time is unfortunately a tyrant here. But to say he was put in command of the whole expedition, let's say with a bit of ambiguity of who really was in charge, because the expedition had been really entrusted to two generals, Eurymedon and Sophocles, that were at command of the fleet. That eventually brought Demosthenes to so here these three figures were a bit actually in contrast with each other. The landing to Pylos, for instance, that would originate the developments of the campaign was not foreseen. Actually, Demosthenes wanted to land in Pylos and to occupy it. Now we'll see why. While Eurymedon and Sophocles wanted just to go on with their mission into Sicily and Corcyra. So Demosthenes, at this point, there was no clear, let's say, hierarchy in the roles, because objectively, at a certain point, Eurymedon and Sophocles also opposed these plans, and were forced by, eventually by the events to take action towards the direction eventually Saint Demosthenes had pushed for. So the idea was essentially now so have to look at a map, and I also have to mark the time that is here. We're arriving at 1350. Okay, so here you have a beautiful map of Greece, and you see essentially in here where I don't know if you read it, the mark 2. Here is the position of Pylos and Sphacteria. So essentially, it would be Navarino Bay, the same place where famously the Ottoman fleet was destroyed by the Anglo-French-Russian fleets into 1827, if I'm not wrong. And it's also the place where Santoro Santa Rosa died, etc. So this kind of Western Europeans that participated together, together with for instance, with Byron, to the war of Greek independence. So it's a place, and it's interesting because Greece naturally has this very ancient history into which many places are associated also to military events. I was on vacations in Greece once. I unfortunately didn't visit this place, but there were others were definitely amazing, and I would love to actually to visit the Navarino Bay one day. Just to see this, because also in this campaign nature really played. Now you can't see it now because this is a pretty large scale map, but later we will go a bit more in detail to what the Navarino Bays looks like. So what do you see here? The Pylos here in Sphacteria. So the Navarino Bay is in this southwestern corner of the Peloponnese. So in the region of Messenia. And you see Sparta is also pretty close. It's actually it's like 50 kilometers from there. And Demosthenes, bypassing through this, knowing that obviously the Athenian fleet had to pass along the Peloponnesian coast, had spotted this place, and then argued together with the other Eurymedon and Sophocles to, had suggested at least to essentially seize Pylos, the heights of Pylos, that are this peninsula that stretches basically at the top, at the north end of the Navarino Bay, that basically encloses. There's a strait. We'll see it better afterwards. Basically, the access to Navarino Bay between the peninsula of Pylos and Sphacteria and the island of Sphacteria. This is just in the front. So this was a very good position actually, because as Demosthenes argued, the Pylos had amazing natural defenses from the, especially mostly from inland, telling you the truth, because I'd say the inner part of this peninsula is very easily defendable. There are certain heights that can be held. It was extremely close to Sparta, plus in a region that was traditionally not very happy of being under the Spartan rule. So Messenia, the Messenians tried, at this point the Athenians were trying to make the Messenians in fact rebel against the Spartans. It also had this extraordinary opportunity of having an island in the front, and that's why eventually the Spartans managed to arrived to occupy it, remaining eventually bottled down in the same island, as we will see, but this is not important, and having and being extremely, however, well defendable also from sea, because the landing spots there are there is actually a long beach all around the coast of the bay, but then this promontory of Pylos is actually also very difficultly accessible by sea, and it's in this sense very well defensible, as we will see at the battle of what happened at the Battle of Pylos as well. So, however, seemingly, Eurymedon and Sophocles actually didn't care about this. They wanted to carry on with their mission, but seemingly they were forced by weather to stop in Navarino Bay. And at this point they encamped probably along the beach at the beginning. This was a kind of a risky moment, because actually the Spartans at this point were pretty, they were pretty close. So of course, in a few days stop, the situation would have, been fairly manageable. There were also certain Messenians around that kind of supported the Athenians probably at some point, and some of them actually, I think, also joined. I think also in the Athenian navy there were certain Messenian sailors as well that eventually joined even into the fight against the Spartans at Pylos. And nature, weather, how you want to call it, forced the Athenian fleet to stop in here. So the Athenians made this camp that was not really to last for much long, because actually the Athenian force was fairly large, and there was a bit of a lack of, especially of masonry, iron masonry tools, and to pick out the stones and to fit them together and all. And the Spartans could intervene from a moment to another. So at this point, probably eventually there was some base that was created in here, probably on the same peninsula of Pylos proper, because Demosthenes managed to make it to make the camp shift in there, as long as now the majority of the Athenian fleet actually carried on, went on north, sailed for north, leaving essentially Demosthenes with a few troops at Pylos. So in this fortified peninsula now, it could be easily defended from both from sea and from land, and just holding this territory into the Spartan, to Spartan territory, let's say, in Messenia. Okay, but pretty close to Sparta, and like could be a thorn in the side for the same Spartans. So Eurymedon and Sophocles sailed for Corcyra, or Corcyra as you want to call it. So to go back to democratic party against the aristocrats, who were instead backed by the Spartans, and they left Demosthenes on Pylos with 5 ships. The Athenians originally, I think they had like 40 ships. I don't remember now. However, they were a consistent force actually. They left Demosthenes with just these 5 ships. So this meant to have actually not such a few men, because this meant to have overall, considering the crews and their complements, at least 1,000 men. However, with a very small force of hoplites, like probably less than 100, say 25, reinforced with something like between 20-30 archers. So this is important, because naturally you have to think, now we haven't discussed how these triremes that the Athenians were using actually were, but the majority of the personnel was naturally the crew on board, that was not meant for combat, at least for close quarter combats in eventual land operations, but they definitely could be used, especially as light infantry, as we've seen. We were talking before about the Psiloi. So the Psiloi were literally these bare, stripped troops that were used as skirmishers, and these crewmen also given especially the Athenian expansion into the maritime adventures, let's say, that naturally were marked by also bitter warfare. These crewmen had kind of transformed in case of need also into skirmishers, but they were not thought like that. And the hoplites were so few, like 75, let's say 70 plus 30 archers, so having only 100 actual combat fighters as a combat force proper. Hoplites were at this time very expensive. They had began to lighten up a little bit their equipment compared to previous times. Even in 50 years, this hoplitic warfare had seen definitely the hoplite equipment getting lighter, so less expensive, but also conferring to the hoplites a bit more of agility that now was needed outside the let's say the traditional battlefields of the Greek motherland, to be a bit more dynamic, also to cope with enemies that were much more mobile with them. So there was this progressive, but this was still the core of the army, like really the core of the fighting force were these hoplites, supported by certain skirmishers. Skirmishers, like archers we've said now, were always complementary to the hoplitic phalanx in a way or in another. I discussed this in one of those videos I was talking about to you before, about the Hellenic slingers and the Psiloi, in fact, in general. So these were troops that could be equipped also with other weapons, mainly javelins usually, but also bows and slings were pretty common. Could be naturally pretty deadly. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. And these light troops were now extremely useful in Hellenic warfare, because they could in fact compensate for those abilities that the hoplites as a combat force really didn't have. You don't send heavy infantry, how hoplites practically are to carry out tasks that they're kind of not used for. The hoplite has to be trained in a certain way. Obviously, these hoplites could definitely, be, in military history, every soldier can transform in a certain sense, given the equipment can vary and all. But naturally, you don't waste an elite, given the quality of your troops, if you have other troops that are much more skilled at doing this kind of other operations and performing these other types of tactics that can be, by the way, extremely useful also to take down other hoplites. So the hoplites really are needed as an anvil to engage the enemy, to keep it basically directed towards your own front and fronting it, essentially confronting it, in fact, frontally, while these other lighter troops kind of jump and run all around, trying to hit the enemy, especially outflanking him, and so on. And we will see how important these troops were raising now in these campaigns. In fact, the Spartans at this point, as we understand, Demosthenes had decided to hold Pylos with his few force, and naturally the Spartans were to intervene at a certain point. But it was actually good that this spot had been occupied. Actually, as we've seen before, nor Eurymedon nor Sophocles, nor actually probably the rest of the hoplites and their officers had wanted to encamp into Pylos. They had been forced to settle on this beach, but eventually they realized, since the Spartans were approaching, as we will see now, that it was better to run on that Pylos Peninsula in the north and hold this ground, and building up a defense, a fortification in there, and to be ready to meet them. And these fortifications were pretty fine, especially from the land side. They could easily repel any assault, because the guys have to assault them with ladders. They have to go one by one, and then you can concentrate over the ramparts, your hoplites assisted by skirmishers, and taking them out one by one. So at this point, the Spartans were actually, by the way, most of this story is told by Thucydides. So it's really, and it's a surprisingly extremely well detailed account, the one we have relatively to the campaign. So there are many precious details, but they're mostly from the Athenian side, naturally. From about the Spartans, we don't know so much, not even about their actual commanders. But we can definitely guess what their situation was. And at this time, we are in May. Pylos was occupied, if I'm not wrong, in late May, 425 BC. The Spartans, the Spartan army of King Agis had at this point entered into Attica towards the end of April. So essentially, even before the usual, a bit early actually. And this was a pretty routine expedition the Spartans carried out to ravage Attica, and hoping to damage Athenian economy, actually, with not a great, as we've seen, with not massive, not many concrete results. Basically, substantial weakening of Athenian economy. And obviously, Athenians would never meet the Spartans in Attica. They preferred to remain behind their walls, never to give battle, because the Spartans had their own enormous fame of the best hoplites of Greece, and meeting them in open field was definitely madness. Also because the hoplitic resources were not very were not infinite. At this point, much of the Athenian military power was based on a deterrent force, and losing a substantial amount of hoplites at this point was not, even for Athens and its enormous resources, something that could really. So there was no reason to meet the Spartans. The damages that were caused by the Spartans into Attica could be easily recovered, so that was it. It was a stalemate, and also pretty static strategical situation in this sense. So you can imagine this time the Spartans ravaging the crops or simply destroying them and destroying the buildings and so on. At this point, the weather was pretty stormy. Seemingly, the Spartans now were kind of having problems for this. Maybe it was the same storm that forced the Athenians to land in the Navarino Bay. We don't know, but what we know that we don't know actually when the Spartans received the news of the Athenian occupation of Pylos, but only after 15 days they had entered into Attica with their army. They withdrew back to the Peloponnese. So this was the shorter of the shortest invasion that that had happened before. So we can reasonably suggest that Sparta was a bit worried what was going on in Pylos. So at this point, the Spartans began to mobilize a very large force of Spartiates and Perioikoi to set off for Pylos. So and other contingents were called up from other allies of the Peloponnese and the and by the way, at this time the Spartans were aware that the 60-ship fleet of Eurymedon and Sophocles had sailed north to excuse me, the Spartans knew about the expedition of Eurymedon and Sophocles towards Corcyra. At this point, the Athenians, the Athenian fleet had actually arrived up to Zacynthus, so this island you see here. So Corcyra is even more than double of the distance from Pylos than Zacynthus, and the Spartans now had a fleet that was campaigning in Corcyra at this point, and was called up to basically come back to attack Pylos. So the idea was to go past the Athenian fleet at Zacynthus, and this was a kind of a risk for the Spartans, and to attack eventually with the fleet and the land forces the Athenian avampost of Pylos on the Pylos Peninsula, where Demosthenes was excuse me, what the hell, this wire was castled, say. Also here about the Spartan side, as we were saying before, we don't know excessively much. We don't know what they really thought, because the problem is that the Spartan fleet at this time was sensibly weaker than the Athenian one. The Athenians, after the Battle of Salamis, had won this deserved first prize as the best mariners of all Greece. They had not just the largest fleet, but also the best one in quality. So actually it was a risk for the Spartans to put something at sea, knowing that it was a larger Athenian contingent, just like this. So the Spartan fleet was called from Corcyra, and somewhat, we don't really know how, they managed to pass Zacynthus without being engaged by the Athenian fleet. So going towards Pylos. And probably, I don't know, maybe they passed with the undercover of darkness. We don't really know. At this time, really, naval technology was not such for which you could really spot where the enemy really was. This is kind of also very fascinating. I mean, until the Victorian times in the 19th century, naval technology didn't allow you really to make an effective blockade. I mean, to stop any kind of fleet. things like this, like having also a major fleet passing by without you noticing, that was technically possible. Also here, historically, we don't know how it happened in this very case, but it was definitely something that could happen. And naturally, you have to imagine scout ships that were going around trying to figure out where the enemy was, what their strengths were, because that was also naturally all a reconnaissance problem that had to be taken into consideration. So the Spartans actually managed to the Spartan fleet reached the Navarino Bay after like 3 or 4 days. They had set off from Corcyra, and they beached their ships actually in along the shore of the harbor, so in the larger open ground. And maybe we can switch now to the other picture, because that can be just to show you now what Navarino Bay in fact looks like. You see here with the orange on the orange area is colored areas is the side of the Spartan camp, where the Spartans placed their fleet. So a pretty consistent force, and this was not extremely defended, as you understand, because it's a kind of a, you know, the bay is opened. If you know, the north end could be blockaded by the Spartans, but definitely the south end really not. So theoretically, the Spartans now landed and beached in here without you know, having to attack the Pylos peninsula. You can see here, just in front, you see in front of the bay there is the island of Sphacteria, where the Spartans also landed a part, because they now let's go by order, but the importance here is you see that Demosthenes' force is settled in here, in this, between the Sikia channel, I don't know if you can read it, and the Voidokilia Bay. And then you see those heights that this is actually a picture of the assault proper that the Spartans were about to mount up now. So let's go by order. So what else that we can say? That the so one first objective actually of the Athenians at this point was being achieved, because we didn't say it before. I'm sorry, I skipped certain of the plans, but I mean the Athenians knew that Corcyra was threatened by the Spartan fleet. So now the Athenians had made it to make the Spartans at least disengage from there and getting into Pylos, though it was a kind of a problem. So the situation had kind of worsened, at least for Demosthenes at Pylos, because now the Spartans were about to attack his avampost, both from land and to sea, with overwhelming force. As we've seen, the Athenians were Demosthenes' force was very small, and the bulk of the Athenian army went along the inside the fleet. Together with Eurymedon and Sophocles. So there was definitely some news about, you know, probably the Messenians were telling now the Demosthenes avampost what the Spartan movements really were, because naturally the Messenians knew it, as they were you know, formally under the Spartans, so they knew what was going on. So Demosthenes sent actually 2 of his 5 ships to Zacynthus to inform Eurymedon and Sophocles that the Spartan fleet was arriving. So as we've seen, for some reason, even though there is no any great degree of certainty now, the Spartans had managed to pass the Athenian fleet unnoticed. So it was vital, given this overwhelming force it was to attack the Demosthenes avampost, that the Athenian fleet would come back to attack the Spartans and to relieve Pylos' avampost from their pressure. So sending two ships, actually these ships were probably sent separately, because this kind of augmented the chance of getting, arriving to Zacynthus, and it at this point the situation was probably these two ships had also been pretty much lightened up, so that he would have that Demosthenes would have made most of the at least of the deck crew and its marines at Pylos, so also to make the ships lighter, so to travel faster with the oars and wind and sails, and hoping in this sense to augment the chances of also escaping the Spartans in case they had been spotted and engaged. So at this time Demosthenes was, however, not disheartened, in the sense that the situation was pretty serious, evidently, but he was confident enough to fence off the imminent Spartan attack. This was due essentially, and it's probably at this point the Athenians had already abandoned Volley. When the Spartans had arrived, even before the Spartans have arrived, they had abandoned the first beach, the first place they had beached in, and settled all into Pylos. So not to leave anyone behind, and to concentrate their forces for the defense of the Pylos promontory. And this area you see here that he had fortified in Pylos was actually very well defensible. Chiefly for one reason, because the Spartan forces at this point were essentially similar to the in type of tactics, etc., were identical to the one of the Athenians. As we've seen, the Spartans had a much higher quality of their hoplites, so that, as we will see now, even during the rest of the campaign, where the Athenian reinforcements arrived en masse, they didn't dare actually engage the Spartans in open field, even with a major numerical advantage. But these were still hoplites, and the main problem with the hoplites is that in order to be effective, they have to be information. So this Pylos Peninsula was not accessible by a phalanx deployed in battle formation. The hoplites had to enter this peninsula separately. From the in the, let's say, east side here from land, the Athenians simply built up a wall that was essentially impregnable from land. Especially this was the strongest part of the defense, and that's probably where Demosthenes in fact maintained only a relatively small force that was able to fence off the enemy attack. There were definitely also certain parts of this peninsula that were protected by unclimbable cliffs. Thucydides remarks that no fortification was needed in this place. But the main attack, the main attack, numerically, was coming instead from the sea, because the Spartans wanted to make this landing on the peninsula, and Demosthenes knew that there were actually very few spots from sea that could be accessed by the Spartans. There was so usually the triremes were conceived also for amphibious operations. Their keels were built in a fashion that basically could allow the ship to beach quite easily during the landing. So basically, like if there was a sandy beach, these ships could be could sail up to the very over the beach in part, so exploiting the momentum and therefore allowing eventually all the hoplites to jump out and to hopefully in a few minutes form up into battle formations and eventually engage the surrounding enemies. Now this was not on the Pylos Peninsula. This was not possible in the sense that only a very few ships at a time could land in here, because the rest of the coast was kind of rocky, so it would have also consistently damaged the ships. By the way, today's Peloponnese is kind of 2 meters higher than it was in the past. You know that the telluric forces in the Mediterranean are pretty intense. So we don't have we can't see today the exact place like it was at the time, but more or less we can observe it's still a pretty rocky in many ways, so you could have not really landed with many forces. So this gave an edge essentially, to make long story short, to Demosthenes forces, because this could be instead already deployed from land and supported by these lighter troops. There were skirmishers, etc. So the Spartan hoplites, in order to land and to form, would have to basically been harassed and countered by the Athenian infantry, and suffering very heavy losses and not even be able to form up. But the Spartans were instead very confident, because they because of this reason, because at this point, by the way, it seems that the Messenians, some Messenians had I don't remember now, should read the passage once again, but it's saying that some Messenians had joined the Athenians now, so that they hadn't increased excessively the enemy, the Athenian forces, but considering that Demosthenes had sent to Triremes, now probably he had like between 700, 800 troops altogether, so perhaps including more than 100 hoplites, and other lighter troops, but the Spartans were way many more. The Spartan army now was approaching. I didn't say it before. The Spartan fleet was 60 triremes strong. Now Demosthenes had the complement of only 5 triremes, so this gives you the exact, not really the exact quantity of the Spartan army, but the ratio between the Spartans and the Athenians, because we actually don't know from the sources how many Spartans were, but we're talking about several thousands, and not just from the ones who were coming with the fleet, but also the ones that were assembling from the mainland. So we're talking about thousands of hoplites and light armed men that were attacking these mere 100 hoplites and some other hundreds of lighter troops. So it seemed a pretty desperate situation, and this part, at least for the Athenians, but they, as we've seen, they were pretty confident what they were doing. The Spartans instead were probably overconfident. They thought they had such a massive numerical advantage that their sheer force would have been enough to break essentially the Demosthenes' avant-post and capture it. So more or less the area, let's say the length of the beach that where the Spartans could land on in Pylos was like 150 meters. The Athenians had partially fortified this as well. And as we were saying before, it's not like a huge area. Only a few ships can land, and the Athenians could concentrate their fire on these few Spartan troops that were landing in therefore trying to stem them. And actually, Demosthenes took only 60 hoplites in this to stop the Spartan attack from the sea, and a few archers actually. So the going on, the Spartans were attacking the Athenians now with a force of 43 triremes from the sea, and so we can count more or less a force of 430 hoplites and 172 archers, given the average complement that of any ship. What I didn't say at this point is that the Spartans had occupied Sphacteria, and that is very important as well, because basically they didn't want eventually the Athenians to the Athenian forces to receive help from this island that could be occupied by other incoming Athenian forces. So that's why the Spartans got onto Sphacteria, and eventually they, as we'll see now, they remained bottled up in there. So this meant really to enclose let's say enclose Demosthenes' force both from land and from sea, not to give them any hope. Also consider the logistical problems of remaining on Pylos now, even if with a few if we have seen there were more or less 700, 800 men. Nevertheless, it's a problem really to keep them fed, to keep them hydrated, and it's not such a comfortable situation. So the Spartans were counting also on this eventually. So the Spartans now were practically about to attack the Athenians. The landing would happen with certain gangplanks that were essentially put ashore when from the ship when it landed, and so the Spartan hoplites were to pass over this tiny narrow plank onto land. So you can imagine being exposed at this time by the fire of the Athenians that would throw like the hell at them, concentrated, say, hoplite after hoplite. And this was the most dangerous moment, the one in which the hoplite was more vulnerable, because the hoplite was, consistently protected as long as it was in formation with those shields set up, but, proceeding one by one, speedily, and in this sense not really not caring even much about what was arriving at him, because he had to run, to be extremely vulnerable, and there was no other way to make it through and to land and to hopefully crash the enemy so by the way, and at this time also there is to keep into account that the Spartans were aware of the presence of the Athenian fleet as well. So this is also kind of an obscure point, because we'll see it later, because they got unprepared also to an eventual Athenian assault by sea. So going on, what else can we say now? Let's pass to the Battle of Pylos, in fact. And so there is a beautiful speech that... So I think you got it clear. If you look at the map, the Spartan camp here was where the main Spartan fleet was beached, was here in the north side of the harbor. A force was deployed into Sphacteria here in the island in front of the bay to prevent any Athenian force to land in there. So now the Spartans launched their assault from land and from sea at the same time, and you see this little place where the five where there is the writing Athenian fort. You can see here this five Athenian ships that were the only ones Demosthenes was left, and these fortifications around Pylos. So now the battle of Pylos began, and there is a beautiful speech that Thucydides made Demosthenes pronounce before the battle, and that explains a little bit the tactics that were used at the time. So here is Thucydides 4:10 for the quote, and it said, "Don't let their superior numbers frighten you. They will have to fight in small groups because space for landing is so limited. You Athenians know from experience what it takes to fight your way ashore against firm opposition. You know that if a man stands his ground, it does not give way to terror at the beat of the oars and the looming hull that bears down on him, he can never be driven back. Now stand firm and stop this attack here, right at the water's edge, and keep us and our position safe." So this is very interesting because Demosthenes was actually at this point an experienced general, and he states this very interesting thing that the Athenians had got pretty experienced into amphibious operations, and they perfectly knew that the main point, to stop an enemy is to stand their ground, information, not to freak out, and to maintain cohesion. Because if he says that explicitly, the space for landing is so limited, you can basically overwhelm now the Spartans arriving. So this is where the map you're looking at now basically represents of the attack. So the Spartan launched this attack. We can say hastily, but they were definitely probably a bit overconfident given the difficulty of the terrain actually to perform such a landing. The Spartan commander in this landing was Thrasymedes, a Spartiate, about which we really know actually a very few. He was an admiral, a nauarchus, so he literally a commander of the navy, and that's all we know. And he eventually got he was a casualty of the landing as well. So Thucydides 4:11 actually goes on. Excuse me, I have to look at I wanted to check one thing before we go on. Yeah. And I wanted to say, wait a second, excuse me, I'm really checking one thing. I'm going immediately because I already have the quote. I wanted really to... Well, okay, let's simply quote the histories 4:11. So this is Thucydides telling us. So the Spartans divided... This is about the landing. The Spartans divided their fleet into small attack groups because there wasn't room for larger numbers to drive ashore. They rowed and stood off in turn, urging each other on with great spirit to land and breach the fortifications. Brasidas, in command of one of the Triremes, excelled above the rest. When he saw other Spartan commanders or helmsmen old enough to save their ships from damage because the approach was difficult but still offered a chance of making a landing, he shouted, "There is no point looking after your ship's timbers while you allow our enemies to establish a fort on our land. Smash them up to get ashore." His rallying cry for the allied commanders was, Remember the good things that Sparta has done for you. Don't hold back payment for them with your ships at this critical moment. Run them aground, get ashore any way you can, and drive these men from their position. Urging the rest on with these words, Brasidas ordered his own helmsman to run his ship in and charge down the gangplank. But as he attempted to get on the shore, he was seriously wounded and thrown backwards. He passed out, and as he fell into the outrigger, his shield slipped off his arm into the sea and was washed ashore. The Athenians picked it up and later used it in the trophy they set up and to mark this successful action. Sorry, here I didn't mention you before who Brasidas was. He was actually the commander of Spartan Trireme, as we have seen in this seaborne assault on Pylos. And according to Thucydides, he displayed this kind of strong leadership. And we don't really know much about him. He was probably responsible, I don't know, for part of the fleet, and he died, as we've seen during this operation. It gives you really the idea of how an hoplite could be killed in this process, running ashore, being hit by an enemy missile, and simply being wiped out like that. And Brasidas was actually, we know a few bit about him. He was kind of a dynamic thinker as a commander. He actually, had he not died, he might have objectively also made probably changed the course of the campaign of Pylos and Sphacteria, but at this point he lost his life on this occasion. So let's go on. Thucydides actually doesn't talk much about the what was happening on the land side at this point, but it seems that even if the Spartans attacked probably contemporarily, but from land and sea, there was no actual connection between the two attacks, in the sense that at least more than happening at the same time. There was no. And probably from land there was no even substantial problem, while probably the harsher fight actually occurred onto the beach on the side of the landing. So you can imagine at this point also this very ferocious assault into which the Psiloi, so these very lightly armored troops, did not just throw missiles at the enemy, but also probably engaging to they were, even if they were not considered as such, but they might have participated even probably with some weapons that were handed to them for close combat, with, I don't know, both hooks, axes, spears, cudgels, and everything that could be available. And at the same time, the archers and other troops using arrows, javelins, slingshots, even rocks and stones. Consider this. Everything at this point is could be of use, and as we've seen before, the actual combat, the theoretical combat force now was just more than 100 hoplites and some other tens of skirmishers actually conceived for that role. But there were all the rest of the crews that were together with these forces that could really support at this point and take, in fact, just a stone and throwing it at the enemy and being actually effective, acting all together. So really the Spartans, while landing, were put under an overwhelming fire. And they so this first attack this Spartan attack was repelled. and it seems that the following day the Spartans tried to, they didn't give up, of course. They tried now to put up some machines, let's say certain siege machinery, especially for probably implementing the attack from the land side. But it seems that this could not be achieved. Naturally, the Spartans had the advantage of fighting on their own land, but even logistically speaking, even in this condition, they had troubles seemingly to bring material like heavy timber and so on to build up things like rams or siege towers or even larger machinery like, I don't know, certain towers or other ladders or stuff like that, because eventually they didn't actually accomplish great much. And in this sense, actually, this shows how, by certain standards, hoplitic warfare, Hellenic warfare was something pretty amatorial in many ways. Not because it was not sophisticated or some, but let's say that the Greeks at this point were still carrying out war into a sort of an amatorial way. Also, their logistics was not excessively developed. In this case, the Spartans, I don't know if when the Persians arrived and they invaded Greece, they brought with them a huge logistical train and were extremely more organized, prepared. Nowadays, here even for building a few siege machinery, at least in this Hellenic troops, it was a bit of a problem, because everything was done actually at a very in economy. The idea was that these troops didn't even want to stay too much long on campaign. These were citizens. Okay, the Spartans were more used even to prolonged warfare perhaps than the Athenians, but generally these world systems didn't have such a huge let's say I can't say experience or trade. I don't know. It's something that is prepared before to mount up this longer operations that entailed now even siege warfare and so on, because it's something that entails essentially making war beyond seasonalism. So to necessarily have already professional troops that do this business of war for a prolonged time. And here the Greeks were still in a phase of transition. So naturally, even episodes like this brought eventually Hellenic warfare to grow more professional, and its logistics to be more complex and articulate. So the main problem now for the Spartans is that we're not acknowledging that Pylos was much more difficult to take than they expected. They probably thought, like, we are so many that we're just gonna overwhelm the Demosthenes forces with sheer numbers. Even from a psychological point of view, even before the strictly physical one. They were wrong, and now especially the Athenian fleet was superior to the Spartan one, was approaching. So this was actually a pretty serious problem for the Spartans. Okay, so another point in here is we don't know what the Spartans were thinking relatively to the Athenian fleet, because now Eurymedon and Sophocles were finally coming back from Zacynthus. Basically, Demosthenes remained uncovered for 2 days. For 2 days, the avamposts at Pylos remained without the cover of the Athenian fleet. Now, evidently, Eurymedon and Sophocles had been warned by those two Demosthenes' ships that he had sent, and they the two admirals had also probably received some further reinforcement to their fleet, so that the Athenian fleet now counted 50 ships. Now, the main problem let's stick now from their side, from the Athenian fleet side. The main problem now was landing into Navarino Bay in some way. As we've seen, the Spartans controlled both the beach and the island of Sphacteria. There were no other major landing places around there, if not at a certain distance, as we will see now. So this entailed, forcefully, that the Athenian fleet had to fight its own way through against the Spartan fleet in some way. Another problem is that in these few days, basically, the Athenian ships were not battle ready, because they had done this kind of 100 kilometers passage from Zacynthus, so they had to recover a little bit. So what they did, and here I don't think we have it in the map, however, is that they landed, they beached or moored their fleet on the island of Prote. That is, I might check here, if you give me, I can look at Google Maps to see what the island of Prote actually is, to give you a bit more of a Kinaliada is this one. No, Kinaliada, this is in Turkey. It has nothing to do with that. I got mistaken. Whatever. I can't find this right now. It could be this one. Yeah, yeah. Here it is. Prote. It's basically I'm googling here the distance. Measure the distance from here to here. So the island of Prote is something like only 13 kilometers, in fact, from Pylos. And consider the Spartans now could see that on the distance. So the Athenian fleet had arrived straight from Zacynthus to the island of Prote. This is just 13 kilometers the north of Pylos, and this as we've seen, they beached or moored their fleet in the Athenians beached or moored their fleet in there, and they camped actually to spend the night. So at this point, the Athenians were planning to attack early in the next morning. So this was the day, 2 days before the first Spartan attack. What had been the first Spartan attack in one day, then the second day there was still pressure on Pylos, but not a major engagement apparently, and the day after now the Eurymedon and Sophocles were planning to attack the Spartans. So at this point the Athenians also did a bit of a preparations. So we can imagine the day before. Just think about even the feelings of knowing to go to battle the day after. It's something that I've always been fascinated to study in the sources of the battle. And they made certain preparations for the ships to be combat ready. And one thing they did was the Athenians practically took down the ship's masts. So in order to and also the rest of the sailing gear to proceed more speedily against the enemy. So 13 kilometers is not very long, and the ship could do it pretty fast. So whatever the battle would have gone, it was better to have their ships, the ships lighter, and just to rely on the force of the oars. So they basically the Athenians now rowed heading towards Pylos and Sphacteria again. Now, what is interesting about this morning is that the Spartans seemingly were not ready to meet the Athenian fleet. Now this is very strange because both from the Greek mainland and from Sphacteria also has this higher ground they could see on the distance, 13 kilometers. It's very close, so they could see even the island of Prota in the north. They could spot the Athenians from the day before, the Athenian fleet in there. But seemingly at this morning, these Spartans were not ready to meet the Athenian fleet. So we don't really know what the Spartan plans really were. At this point, the Athenians basically attacked Navarino Bay, both from the Sicyan channel and the southern entrance, so south of Sphacteria. And, I might change picture at this point. Yeah, it's better. I take note of which moment I have to do this. Alright. So, they here in the picture it's brilliantly showed how the Spartans in the morning had their fleet, had brought naturally from the days before their fleet back to the beach, to the main Spartan camp, and the Athenians actually entered Navarino Bay both through the Sicyan channel and the southern entrance. Now, this is what is interesting is that the Spartans had not basically even tried to block the Sicyan channel. That is actually pretty easy to block even with a few ships, while the southern end is much more difficult to block. So naturally, it was kind of demanding to maintain these ships ready all of that. But even to put them in water and maintaining the crews in there, because the crews, by the way, think out how crowded the ships really were. But the point now is, so there were certain logistical problems, but at least for some days, especially knowing that the Athenian fleet was approaching, the Spartans could have mounted up a sort of block. Instead, this didn't happen. The Athenians basically fell. They entered into the bay and they attacked the Spartan ships that were beached in there. Naturally, the Spartans attempted a response, which could be relatively quick to mount up in a certain sense. We don't think that crossing the Athenians probably spent like not more than 15-20 minutes from the time they entered the beach to the bay to reach the beach, actually, because it's not such a big distance. And at this point, only part of the Spartan fleet was ready for combat, and they tried to meet up the Athenian into these waters. But this was a hopeless situation. The Athenians were well deployed. They had really the best ships at this point, the best crews, so there was an edge they really had. The Spartans at this point were also pretty amazed. They probably were also partly disordered, and we know actually that they were suffering pretty badly of the Athenian assault. In fact, Thucydides in his Histories 4:14 writes, the Athenians rammed many of them, the Spartans, after they had got to the beach, and some of them while the crews were still boarding and before they could put out to sea. They disabled others and began to tow them away after the crews had abandoned them. At the sight of all this, the Spartans on the shore became frantic, realizing that their comrades were about to be cut off on the island, that is the island of Sphacteria, and they rushed to the ship's rescue. They dashed into the sea fully armed and tried to get hold of them and drag them back. Each one was so focused on this that he behaved as if he was engaged in the action all on his own. It was absolute chaos. This remark is very 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 how do you say that? Very meaningful, simply because it really gets straight to the point that the Spartans were losing their mind because they were taken by surprise, so they were acting as if they were doing that all on their own. This is kind of extremely important in warfare because collective training, order, discipline wins over people who might be individually very capable, but if they do things alone, they kind of are useless against someone who instead is acting all together. So the Spartans naturally also put up a pretty intense fight at this point. That they didn't give up easily. And as we've seen, this other major problem now was that they realized that the troops, the Spartiates that had remained onto Sphacteria, now with the approaching of the arrival of the Athenian ships, were risking to be cut off. So some of them were even trying to run to them and to put them in safety. As we've seen, the Spartans had deployed troops on Sphacteria exactly to prevent the Athenians to seize the island, which now they objectively were succeeding to do, because the Athenians were not daring to land on Sphacteria, knowing that there was a consistent force of Spartiates that could really essentially hold them off, just like the Demosthenes had done with the same Spartans. And by the way, at this point, the Athenians didn't really know how many Spartans were on the island. So that was something you didn't want to do. As we have seen, the Athenian hoplites were not eager to meet the Spartans not even on equal ground, even with maybe an overwhelming numerical superiority. And you can imagine, to invade an island was held in defense by the Spartans. So pretty serious situations. But now another problem was happening, that given the Athenians now were massacring the Spartan fleet, now Sphacteria and the Spartans on that island were to remain isolated. Much of a problem for the same Spartans. Thucydides underlines especially the great skill and expertise the Athenians were practicing their naval tactics here by ramming and going back and forth, and this was very, very important to crush the enemy, the Spartan ships, and to naturally put them out of use. Most of these ships, by the way, were not even properly Spartan. They actually belonged to their allies, because Sparta, as we've seen, was not much of a maritime power. So this had all a pretty big cost. And there was also a lot of fight into because parts of the Athenians actually possibly landed, or at least they were assaulting the Spartan ships that were still beached. So that were on land, partially on the shore. So there was actually a very intense fight in here, into which the Spartans managed to hold the Athenians off in some way, even if they suffered so many casualties and were basically prevented from putting at sea and effectively to make something about it. So the Spartans now by Thucydides are told to have been able even to assault certain ships, to recover certain ships the Athenians had seized now on the shores or close to it by fighting on them. So a pretty messy engagement that resembles partly probably also the engagement of Marathon, when the Athenians assaulted the Persian ships that were about to sail off, and that some of which they managed to capture. So a moment to which you couldn't basically carry out hoplitic tactics, but because obviously on the ship's decks it was everything much more complicated. There was no formation, no cohesion. There were all these bullets flying everywhere, so it was really a pretty there could be some cohesion, but it was something extremely messy and definitely bloody. So the here Thucydides 4:14 says, each side put up a hard fight and there were many casualties. The Spartans managed to win back their unmanned ships except for those that had been taken at the beginning of the battle, and both sides eventually broke off the engagement. However, the Athenians set up a trophy, gave the Spartans their dead, and took possession of all disabled ships. Then immediately they began patrolling around the island, guarding the prisoners they had cut off there. The Spartan army on the mainland, with all the reinforcements that had arrived from every direction, stared where it was, facing Pylos. So now practically the situation has changed because of the of what we said before. So basically, the during this battle in the harbor, the Spartan fleet was knocked out. And there was no way now for the Spartans to basically reach once again the to reach Sphacteria. And this was a big of a problem because basically the Spartiates that existed on Sphacteria were cut off, were in the hands of the Athenians. So at this point, after this fight, the Spartans were maintaining their obviously control of the land, because the Athenians had no way to control that, and keeping pressure against the fortifications of Pylos that still held, because you have to see in here that indeed the Athenians had basically, aside from Prote and maybe some other scattered, they had no other base around. So even all the forces now that had come back with those 50 Athenian ships, so this main force of thousands that existed now, that had come back to Navarino Bay, had no other place to stay but the same fortifications of Pylos that were keeping to hold while they were besieged by the Spartan land force, terrestrial forces. So at this point there was a stalemate, because from one side Pylos, now we've seen, could not be attacked. The land fortifications were quite strong. The Spartans were taking time to build up this siege machinery, but never achieved, eventually to assault these fortifications because they were too strong. At the same time, they couldn't also bring their they had lost their fleet, so they couldn't assault once Pylos by land. They couldn't evacuate the Spartan, their own forces from Sphacteria. So now the problem from the Athenians was just a matter of a logistical matter, because all those thousands of troops were pretty much concentrated into Pylos. So even from a logistical point of view, in terms of hygiene, of finding even fresh water, think about how many thousands of people will need to drink, to eat, and think also about another problem of all the all the more let's say all the the other strictly hygienical problems related to thousands of people concentrating in such a small place. So this was also pretty risky, and certain peace negotiations kind of followed now, because both sides thought that this stalemate couldn't really be broken, because even the Athenians know that they couldn't really last in Pylos forever. So this was happening into summer now. Everything we've seen was happening at the end of May. It was happening in May, and now the good season was on. And until there was good season, the fleets could be at sea. But at the end of this good season, bad weather could force the Athenians to leave if they didn't want to have their fleet damaged in the world situation. So now the Spartans actually were pretty comfortably waiting for this to happen, because they knew that the Athenians couldn't attack the Spartans on Sphacteria, because it would have been extremely difficult to do. And they, by the way, the Spartans now on Sphacteria were even concealing their forces, because the island was all forested, and they basically, we'll see it later, they were deploying these forces not being observed by the Athenians. By the way, Sphacteria is also a higher ground than Pylos, so the Athenians couldn't really look from the above, while actually the Spartans could look the Athenian fortification on Pylos from the above. So it would have been extremely risky to attempt an assault of Sphacteria by land from the Athenians. So at this point the negotiations were pretty serious, because, by the way, the Spartans, now it was really a matter of manpower. That one of the major strategical problems of Sparta was the lack of many numbers of Spartiates. So the Spartiates were the citizenry, the military class of Sparta. They were basically the bulk of Spartan power, as these very highly trained hoplites that couldn't be matched at this point by any other phalanx in Greece. So they were holding more than 400 of them into Sparta, so a huge number that had a huge strategical value. And they were extremely upset something could happen, and because losing these hoplites would have equated to make Spartan power considerably shrink, given this loss in manpower, this best tactical resources that made, in this sense, also a strategical resource. So the Athenians now were proposing essentially the obviously they didn't want to lose the opportunity of letting those Spartiates go. So obviously they wanted to take them, and they were asking the Spartans basically to surrender them. The Spartans absolutely didn't want this. On the contrary, they asked Athens for a truce, and saying, okay, let's even become allies again, because theoretically, before the Peloponnesian War and all the conflict that already existed since the end of the Persian Wars between Athens and Sparta, theoretically these were the powers that had emerged as victorious from the Persian Wars. The main ones, and they were the most powerful. So the Spartans now were suggesting this kind of weird thing to get allied together, just free our Spartiates and Sphacteria, and everything is gonna be fine. So they essentially, both the Athenians and the Spartans refused each other's proposals of peace, and they and basically warfare went on during the summer. Again, this Pylos was still under siege. Sphacteria was still blockaded by the Athenian fleet that was out there, stationed in around Pylos. So and protested. So what was that now could really happen? This was a big, actually pretty big stall. Now there are many complicated elements now to take into consideration, but we explained now what the main problem really was, and now things were kind of changed because of Athenian politics, and because of this we have to talk about Cleon. Thucydides talks about this figure. He defines him the most aggressive of all the Athenian citizens. He was a demagogue with great influence over especially the masses of the people. So Athenian democracy was, in this sense, developing towards this direction, and he was a very powerful orator. He belonged to this new breed of politicians that essentially achieved his results more into the councils and in tribunals than actually by getting offices like, of positions of responsibility, like being a general and so on. And in fact, he was not a military man. He had never been elected general, but eventually, 425 now, he was forced to do so, because he was, albeit not being a military man, he was actually pushing for a very aggressive strategy. He was basically challenging the Athenian the Athenian conservatives at this point to attack the Spartans on Sphacteria, because he said basically, if we wait too much, this was normal consideration, was bad weather will arrive, we'll be forced to take our army and fleet out of Navarino Bay, and we will lose those Spartans. We will easily go back home. Because, by the way, this is what I didn't say is that the island of Sphacteria is actually was actually pretty fine for those Spartiates to stay in there. There was a spring, so with fresh water. There were enough rations. At this time, both sides actually managed to sneak food in, trying to avoid the other's blockades. There were extremely ingenious systems. People who also swam underwater. Things that were the local. There were also the locals who provided food to some. So this strategical balance basically was holding, because there was actually no factor that was going to alter it before the bad season arriving, and therefore forcing the Athenians to flee and making basically the Spartans on Sphacteria free. So Cleon, or Cleon, I think I will stick to Cleon as a pronunciation, was essentially now challenging Niches, who was a very competent but cautious general that at this time had retired, and he was kind of he was from the conservative side. Cleon was a bit more of an imperialist and a radical politician that was pro the lower classes. Niches was a bit more conservative, and they, indeed, the expansion of the Athenian Empire entailed also this raise of the classes. There had been all the problem of these classes of the Oars that had participated from Salamis, this major naval fortunes. Now we can't get into detail from this, but there were many contrasts within Athenian society at this point. So Cleon was telling them, to this class of conservatives, represented by Niches, you're incapable of exploiting these situations. We have these Spartans blocked into Sphacteria, and you're not doing anything about it. And I tell you to go take them. So many people laughed at Cleon in the assembly, because they told what the hell meant. These are Spartans. How can we assault an island that is defended by Spartans with our forces? We're Spartan hoplites. Gonna be kicked away. I mean, even if it had been in open ground, it would have been extremely difficult to defeat them. You can imagine now if we have to land in there and to be assaulted by these compact Spartan phalanx when we are landing in a completely scattered way. So Cleon at this point was essentially saying he could have provided essentially the necessary forces for attacking Sphacteria and taking prisoner the Spartans. At this point, it was a great laughter, a great hilarity and sarcasm. Like, how do you think you can achieve that? And basically Cleon himself was forced by the assembly to say, okay, you think you can do it? Okay, do it. And so the Athenians appointed Cleon as general, and they challenged him to take the Spartans. So basically they said, okay, you want to be so aggressive, you're so sure we can make it to take this part, okay, why don't you do it yourself? And he was, in this sense, forced to accept the challenge. And this was actually a very bold move. Very interesting in this scenario is also the relation between Cleon and Demosthenes, because Demosthenes was a bit of an anti-political, I mean, not really anti-political, but apolitical figure. He was a kind of a balanced, neutral character that, was growing in experience as a general, as a commander. He had suffered some defeats, but he was a very considered man. And Cleon knew about what the situation was in Navarino Bay, because there were naturally reports of what was happening. And by the way, Eurymedon and Sophocles wanted to a bit conceal the situation, to tell them that everything was kind of fine, they were in charge of the situation, but it was obvious that now the Athenians were running out of time, and they could have lost this extremely fantastic prize of taking 400, they didn't know how many they were actually, but at this time, but a consistent number of Spartiates as prisoners, and therefore having an enormous bargaining power over the Spartans, and consequently creating an extremely favorable, being an extremely favorable situation to negotiate with them at that point. And Cleon was informed about what Demosthenes at the time was suggesting, that because Demosthenes had certain the experiences, let's say, that also pretty traumatic ones, that he had against the lighter troops around, especially against the Aetolians, and he was grown aware of the importance of these skirmishers, and he was buzzing in his mind that he could have achieved a similar result with his own Psiloi against the Spartans. So probably Cleon contacted him. There was an information about this thing, and Cleon was clever enough to accept this thing. I mean, of taking so many lighter troops that could, in this sense, assault the Spartans on this difficult ground of this Sphacteria island. It was extremely forested and also difficult in some ways for politic warfare, and to harass them with this lighter. And this was something, and to win over them through these skirmishing tactics. And this was something new. This is actually what makes eventually what happened so great, because at the time the Greeks had started to suffer a bit of these defeats, especially the Athenians, that had come a bit more far in the world and meeting other populations that fought in that fashion. They knew how effective those tactics could be against their own phalanxes. The Spartans were a bit more traditionalist usually, so they also had developed partly these lighter troops, as we've seen also in the Athenian army. There were a bit more there was already at this time a greater importance put on skirmishers and so on, but nobody at this point had actually ever defeated an hoplitic army just with those tactics on the Greek motherland. So nobody could ever think that, the best hoplites of Greece, the Spartans, could be defeated simply resorting to these tactics. And this was a great cultural obstacle to get past, because there was a great, not only this was not thought feasible, I mean, concretely speaking, in practice, but it was also felt as a kind of a barbaric solution, because the Greeks at this point were building their own identity, on their politics, or their socio-political models, on their military models of the phalanx that were thought to be the ideal model in the Hellenic mind. And all the other peoples were allegedly barbarians, so they were kind of inferior, and resorting to their own tactics was essentially becoming a barbarian. So it was very difficult even to propose such a thing. And that's why certain figures like Demosthenes, that was an experienced general that had known what the reality was beyond the the ideal, the stereotype, and Cleon was this kind of new politician, was against this conservative side of society, so even more aggressive, and breaking kind of the schemes and the methods, the frame of mind, because this is actually what the point was this very useful combination, and eventually achieved the results that we will see now in Sphacteria. So at this point, Cleon was actually allowed as a general by the Athenian government to raise this force that, by the way, he promised would have not been made up of Athenian citizens. This was also another promise that Cleon had made, because also, as we've seen before, the Greek citizens were not so eager to go to war. It was kind of, war was perceived as an unavoidable necessity, but especially outside of the Spartan world, it was minimalized in the Greek. The Greeks felt a contempt for the prolonged exercise of war. So now Cleon was allowed to raise essentially certain troops from a bit the outskirts of the Hellenic world, the Athenian colonies of Lemnos and Imbros, and some peltas from Ennis in Thrace, as well as other 400 archers that were probably recruited either in Crete, that was renowned and famed for his archers, but also from the Black Sea area. So probably most of, at least a consistent part of these troops were not even Greek. And this is very important because, in fact, as we've just said, the Greeks were kind of not used to this kind of tactics, so it was much easier to find these skirmishers, these light troops that all around and outside the Greek world, that indeed were essentially present pretty much everywhere. Like in all the rest of the world, like the skirmisher was the average trooper, we can say. So which best skirmisher than the ones who actually make a living out of it, like in the barbarian world, indeed. So these forces were raised and brought to Navarino Bay, and Cleon actually maintained his promise to raise these troops in only 20 days. So he managed to combine, to raise them and to head to Pylos with them. So the promise, the ultimate promise, was naturally to either to seize to capture or to kill the Spartans on Sphacteria. So an extremely audacious undertaking that caused certain comments, like in the Athenian assembly, like there could be like only two outcomes, both good, that either the Athenians would have got soon rid of Cleon, or even less likely but not less handsome, that those Spartans would have captured as prisoners of war. So at this time, actually Cleon asked also Demosthenes to share the office of to share command on the operation. And this is important because this stresses, emphasizes the cooperation that existed between these two minds relatively to this plan that seemed extremely bold. So, in fact, essentially, the kind of troops, specialized troops that were raised by Cleon were the same ones that Demosthenes had asked for, implicitly. So this okay, what else can we say now? So now Demosthenes had a very consistent force of approximately 1,200 men, of which it was a bit of a mix between hoplites, Psiloi, and archers. And another thing that we didn't tell actually is that at this point into the hoplitic tactics there were certain type of troops known as the ectramoi. They were conceived as a bit of a lighter version of the hoplites that could even fight with javelins. That also expresses the progressive the increasing of dynamism into the hoplitic tactics at this point, at the end of the 5th century BC. So something that had already slowly evolved in the mindset of the Greeks relatively to the to the evolution of their own traditional tactics. Then there were also archers, so it was a pretty extremely strong missile fighting strength actually, and there were probably also other hoplites would join, but so probably the quantity was in fact here 1,200 if I understood correctly. So the plan now was essentially to get on Sphacteria first of all. Now I think at this point the Athenians had during this time had continuously observed the Spartan movements in Sphacteria in order to figure out the force of the Spartans. They needed essentially the Spartans at this point were still concealing their forces because they didn't want to show the Athenians how many they were, where they were deployed. So this basically brought them to have to keep a relatively low guard of the beaching of the landing points. Now there were two ships that Athenian ships that daily went around the island of Sphacteria, and they also proceeding in different directions so that they could cover more quickly all the sides of the islands as at once. So the Spartans at this time had also got kind of used to see these Athenian ships going around. The main problem was not to make this, but because this was crucial. It was to land those troops on Sphacteria. And this was the main problem, because the Athenians were still inferior to the Spartans. If the Spartans had all gathered on the landing spot in the south of the island, that was the most adequate for doing such a thing. So the Spartans had not to be made suspicious by the Athenians, and the main point was actually to secure the beach landing and to eventually make with a small force, then to eventually land the greater one. So the Athenians at this point tried to conceal their I think just one trireme for one of those reconnaissance ships that were sent around the island, and instead loading them with hoplites and archers that could be enough to seize the landing area. So this could take actually a very few minutes. The landing was crucial in the sense if it was met immediately, it was countered immediately. It could be aborted if and prevented if it had been contrasted immediately. But actually, if only one ship landed and those few hoplites could land and form into a formation, it could be already an effective fighting force. And the Battle of the Island at this was started at the second week of August. As we said before, now the Athenians had occupied Pylos in early May. And at this point, the Athenians were still hoping through negotiations to make the Spartans on the island surrender. But the Spartans basically said nuts, so they didn't want to even to do anything like that. So Demosthenes and Cleon at this point waited for 1 day, and they embarked 800 hoplites on a very few ships, and proceeding under cover of the darkness. This was extremely important because, as we've said, there were 2 Athenian ships that were kind of sailing all timing around the island, so the Spartans were kind of getting used to these movements, and they probably exchanged these ships, if they had ever spotted them, for the same patrol ships that were habitually performing this scouting around the island. And although maybe the time was a bit different because this was happening at night, so it was naturally also more difficult to spot, but it was probably nothing so extremely different from what the Spartans were seeing happening all around. We know just this transport could be carried out very easily in the sense that the distance to cover now was extremely short, as Sphacteria was just out there. The Athenians could embark like 40-50 hoplites on a single ship at this point, and there could have not been extremely difficult to do, and some of them might actually been just embarked and on the place of the rowers, so reducing the needs of space, so that 800 hoplites could have been landed on Sphacteria this first wave with only like 8 ships at maximum, let's say. So this force could really disembark quite quickly in a few minutes and to deploy, and no further complications could have occurred. this was very important because the Athenians knew the Spartans were concealing themselves within the forests of the island, within the bushes, the woods. So they knew that these landing sites were kind of undefended. They probably still didn't know how many the Spartans actually were, and actually the Spartans at this point were divided in three in three forces. There was the main Spartan force on Sphacteria was the one in the center of the island itself, because there was a spring in here, so it was logistically more useful for the majority of the Spartan hoplites to be in here. This force was commanded by the commander-in-chief on the island. That was the Spartan Epidatas. There was another group of troops, so a small detachment of hoplites that were instead located into the north end of the island, that had the highest ground of the whole island, and the Mount Elias. So from here, actually, the Spartans could have watched everything what was happening on Pylos without even being seen by the Athenians. And a few troops were enough to control this point, because it was located so on a high ground, plus it was backed by very high cliffs. So at least on certain sides it was considered to be impregnable. And there was at this point also the remnants of an ancient fort with certain rough stone wall, and also other rocky outcrops that reinforced all the perimeter on the slopes on other sides. So this was kind of the gathering place in case of emergency, like, the place where you would fall back in case of a last stand, because it was extremely easy to defend. There was the other detachment, instead the third and last one, was instead in the far south of the main encampment, from like between half of a kilometer or a kilometer south of the springs, and this was the detachment that had the task of protecting the coastline, for preventing landings, essentially. And it was actually a pretty small force. It was manned by just 30 hoplites and probably some other Psiloi of equal number, because in the Spartan army the Psiloi were actually the helots that were in this sense acting as servants of the Spartiates. So the detachment of Mount Elias was somewhat larger, perhaps 50. So Epidatas' central force would have totaled about 340 men, not more. So it was actually not an extremely small contingent, but it was a bit, a bit split up, and now we see what the Athenians dealt and exploited the situation. You can imagine there was naturally a lot of debate also in the Athenian assembly about, Cleon's decision of what had to be done and not to be done, given all the reconnaissance that could be the intelligence telling how many Spartans there were, how many there weren't. So there were still lots of things that had not been figured out. but Demosthenes and Cleon had their own good plan in mind, and it eventually worked. So at this point, the Athenians knew perfectly about at least the southern Spartan outpost. They didn't know much about the rest, as we've seen, because it was covered with trees and so on. So the plan now was to send in this smaller detachment that, in fact, over 800 men during the night managed to land in the south of Spiteri and to take out the southern avampost. So this was overrun pretty easily. As we were saying, the main force of the Spartans was not there because they didn't want to show how many they effectively were. So to make the Athenians insecure about whether to take action or not, in this sense. So at dawn, Demosthenes, having secured the beach, brought instead his main force. So of between 8,000 and 9,000 non-hoplite troops, because if you have seen, these were mostly also the crews of the ships that could also used as light infantry of skirmishers in the case. Actually, in fact, most of the let's say there was a kind of a large number of crewmen that were landed onto Sphacteria as well, so abandoning the ships that were, however, still guarded by the Thalamioi oarsmen and other this minimal marines that had to keep eventually the ship defended and you know, ready eventually to be banned as well. So Pylos actually remained with a very few troops, a small garrison of hoplites, archers, and Psiloi, while this massive force of thousands was shifted to Sphacteria. So this was the plan, was to overwhelm the Spartans with sheer numbers. So at this point, Thucydides actually writes that the ships involved into the landing were 70. The point is, however, looking at the shoreline of probably the ships were in total less than 50. So it's possible that some of them were not actually landed, but maybe, I don't know, they made a sort of you know, kind of just waited there and provide support, and you know, to land every once in a while. And at this time, much of these ships had been coming from the same proto, by the way, so that they had always remained a bit far to augment eventually the surprise would have been achieved through the landing in so not to make the in Sphacteria, so not to make the Spartans suspicious in any way, and not to spread warning in the island. So naturally, the wolfing had been done at night, and eventually only with the sunlight things got a bit more dynamic. So Thucydides 432-34 here gives an extremely detailed account of what was going on. So here it goes. Demosthenes organized his force in two groups of 200, some larger, some smaller, and had them take up positions on areas of high ground up and down the island in order to create the maximum uncertainty in the minds of the Spartans. The Spartans could not decide which way to turn to face the enemy forces now surrounding them on every side. They were completely enveloped by overwhelming numbers. If they charged out to the front, they were showered with missiles from behind. If they charged out on one flank, they were attacked on the other. Whichever way they turned, the enemy Psiloi were always at their backs and very difficult to engage with because of their capability of fighting from a distance with arrows, javelins, stones, and slings. And the Spartans were quite unable to get to close quarters with them. When the enemy fell back, they outran the Spartans, and when the Spartans backed off, they turned on them again. This was what Demosthenes had in mind when he first started planning a landing, and this was the way he now executed it. When the main contingent under Epidates' command on the island had seen that their guard post had been wiped out and that the landing force was moving towards them, they formed up and advanced on the Athenian hoplites with the objective of engaging them in close combat. The hoplites were directly to their front while the Psiloi were on their flanks and behind them. But they were unable to get to grips with the hoplites and bring their expertise to bear. The Athenian Psiloi kept them in check by showering them with missiles from all sides while the hoplites stayed out of the fight, making no move to meet their advance. Whenever the Psiloi came in close, the Spartans drove them off, but then they would wheel and renew their attack. They were equipped for mobility, and the Spartans with their heavy shields could not get to grips with them on this difficult terrain which had never been cultivated. So for a while the two sides skirmished in this way, but the Spartans were becoming tired and less able to dart out in response to each thrust against them. The Athenian Psiloi saw that the Spartans' counterattacks were becoming increasingly sluggish and so grew more confident. They could now see how greatly they outnumbered the Spartans, and they began to realize that they were rather less formidable an enemy than universally reckoned. They were also encouraged by the fact that they had not suffered the casualties they had expected on first landing, overawed as they had been by the thought that it was Spartans they were taking on. Now they had less respect for them. So they gave a great roar and charged them in a mass, pelting them with stones, arrows, and javelins, whatever they had to hand. The loud shouting and all-out assault were very unsettling for men who were not used to this kind of fighting. Also, clouds of ash from the brush fire were being kicked up. They could not even see what was right in front of their faces, whilst the hands of many showered arrows and stones down on them through the dust storm. The engagement now became real difficult for the Spartans. Their Pylos helmets could not protect them from the arrows, and the heads of the javelins snapped off when they struck. The Spartans were helpless. They could not see what was in front of them. They could not hear commands called out to them above the louder shouts of the enemy. With danger on every side, they were losing hope of defending themselves or reaching safety. So this is a very interesting passage actually, because it shows so many incredible factors. First of all, this moral hype that the Athenians now had in having managed to overrun the landing post that the Spartans had. Seeing that the Spartans were getting tired. This is the point. The Spartans were mostly hoplites, even if they had ekdromoi, so these kind of lighter troops. They were now being exhausted by fighting against the lighter javeliners. So this was getting, they were getting exhausted with their heavy armors and so on. Then obviously it's very interesting, this idea of the mass attacking with all these missile weapons. As well as the other effects like these brush fires that had been lightened up to smoke the Spartans, to hold their views, to make them grow more thirsty, more exhausted, and really throwing everything at them. And also, it's interesting that the Athenians did not expect to actually make it to that point, so the Spartans in this campaign are actually taken by surprise more often than they ought to have had. In fact, could make a bit of criticism. At least this is the Athenian version that Thucydides gave us. So, but it would have been interested to know what the Spartans actually thought of how they had dealt with this campaign. But it's so very interesting because at this point the Spartans were completely disoriented. It was a lot of mess, this enormous mass of troops that threw literally the hell at them, and losing hope and even putting to safety. So, as you understand, Demosthenes' strategy was based essentially on keeping the distance from the Spartan hoplites to avoid contact, because all these lighter troops that he had moved out naturally were not good at hand-to-hand combat against the Spartans. But just to skirmish them, and this was quite easy because the skirmishers were much faster than the heavier equipped Spartan hoplites. It's interesting that Thucydides states the Pylos helmet. The Pylos helmet is incidentally this name given because it was found in Pylos as well. It was a kind of a lighter helmet than the all-enveloping Corinthian type. It is a brilliant example of how the hoplite equipment was progressively getting lightened up at this point. What is interesting is that it was allegedly made of felt, not of bronze, even though actually at this point we know that the Spartans still used definitely bronze helmets, and they would continue to do it just like the other Greeks. But here the important is that it was a much lighter equipment. In fact, it is believed that even certain of these hoplites at this point at the end of the 5th century didn't actually wear any metal armor, but rather something like this felt or linen or other stuff to make them lighter. So it's really the practice had evolved a little bit. It's very interesting also that this made naturally having a felt helmet also equated to being less protected. So here Thucydides stated perfectly, as the missile could be. Missiles could wound the Spartans through this felt cap. And this is interesting also because it's as if these hoplitic formations had specialized now more in movement, in speed, and to carry out maybe more maneuvers, so that being lighter was a thing, and that it was actually the collective formation that made the difference, and not how heavily armored hoplites were actually equipped. We'll leave these comments also from another video about the evolution of hoplitic equipment and warfare in general. And being so light, they were taking into account, in fact, also the effect of these missile troops that were instead pretty deadly, as we were seeing. So there were also lighter hoplites, that Spartan hoplites, that now were definitely trying to hit the retreating skirmishers when they approached, and some arguably made it, but that was not the point. The point was at a kind of a broader strategical point, at the idea of basically that Demosthenes had created all these various armored detachments of less than 200 men strong, popping out all over the island. So they were disconcerting the Spartans because they were appearing everywhere, and the Spartans didn't know from which side basically they had to move as a phalanx. The phalanx has only one front, so these forces were basically about to surround them and to create a problem, because wherever they turned, they couldn't, there was always someone else from another side who was attacking them. We know, quite interestingly, that the same Brasidas that eventually would fight in 423 BC against the Illyrians, that were also masters and skirmishers. The Spartans had certain tactics they used to escape from this targeting. In fact, Thucydides himself writes about on that occasion 2 years later, seeing that the Illyrians were about to attack, Brasidas formed his hoplites into a square and placed his contingent of Psiloi inside of it and prepared to retreat. He positioned the youngest soldiers where they could dash out to meet an attack from any direction, and himself stood ready at the rear with 300 picked men to make a stand against the leading ranks of the enemy to screen the withdrawal. This is from the Histories for 125. So this is very, very interesting. Because it tells that the Spartans had actually means to respond even to the fire of these skirmishers. So the Helots that were following their feudal masters of Sparta were kind of behind them, behind the hoplites, and also throwing javelins at the same time, together with the ectremoi hoplites as well. So these hoplite skirmishers that also existed. And it's interesting because in Illyria, the Brasidas 300 Spartan hoplites actually made it to successfully retreat with such a formation. At this point, in fact, the Spartans, however, on Sphacteria still fought on. They also probably tried to open partly their gaps in order not to form since they were not, however, fighting against very heavy opponents, they could relatively open their gaps so that the enemy had not shock power to actually enter in this formation, and being mostly light troops, the Spartans also as individual fighters now could resort to these abilities to kill them individually. So the Spartans in this were probably also partly more dynamic in the process, but were still overwhelmed by numbers. So this you have to imagine literally everything raining on them, like this, even not just the Acontian, the javelin type that was this longer one, thrusting spear, but also little spears like the Doratia, as they were called in Greek. So this kind of more like darts. Smaller javelins, so things that could be also pretty nasty, and some of these javelins had actually been similar even to the mechanism of the later Roman pilum. I mean, the idea that they could be broken at impact and to get stuck, so that they could have not even be reused by the enemy. So quoting always the Histories 435. And this is also interesting. It says, eventually, after taking many casualties as they were pushed to and fro over the same patch of ground, the Spartans closed ranks and started to fall back towards their strong point, not far away at the top of the island, to join up with the men guarding it. As soon as they began to retreat, the Athenian Psiloi pressed forward with even greater confidence and louder shouts. Any Spartans they caught were killed, though most of them managed to withdraw to the fort and took up positions alongside the troops guarding it to defend it at every point that could be attacked. And the Athenians were right behind them, but the strength of the position prevented them getting round it to encircle the Spartans, so they kept trying to dislodge them with frontal attacks. For a long time, indeed, for most of the day, both sides held their ground, enduring the fighting and thirst and the heat of the sun. One side determined to drive the enemy from the high ground, the other determined not to give way. But it was now easier for the Spartans to put up a defense than before, because their flanks were no longer unprotected. So, very interesting here is showing it's the fact that the Spartans managed to retreat in a somewhat orderly fashion, in spite of the dire conditions into which they were, which actually speaks for the Spartan crafts of arms, as we've seen, the glory of the Spartans really relied, and the pride of the Spartans, on this extreme training that could make them maintain formation even in the most desperate situations like this one. So not to grow dispirited, to remain, to maintain cohesion, to still to work in formation, and to, in this sense, successfully retreat. After all, as we've seen, both because of the ground and because of the composition of the Athenian army, the Athenians could not basically press hard on the Spartans with a shock force. So in this condition, the Spartans were still enough cohesed, in spite of exhaustion, in spite of casualties and so on, to retreat. And it was an enormous achievement for men who are exhausted. So that's why the Spartans were so great, actually. So at this point, the Spartans basically managed to retreat to the safest point of Sphacteria, that as we've seen was the peak of Mount Elias. At this point, there is actually a term that now I just said that the Athenians could not push hard on the Spartans with a shock force. They couldn't, but given their numbers and their missile firepower, they could really press hard the Spartans anyway. In fact, the term that Thucydides used to tell that now the Athenians could not dislodge the Spartans once they arrived onto Mount Elias is osastai, that basically has the same etymology of the word otismos, which is actually the term that is used to define the movement of shoving of the two phalanxes when they were pressing together, like football players one against the other, so pushing very, very hard. So it's as if basically Thucydides was stressing the equation of this hard pressure put up by the Athenian Psiloi with one of the phalanx, given their sheer size of their sheer numbers and the firepower they had as lighter troops. So now the Spartans retreated to the safe ground. And another point in here is that actually Demosthenes and Cleon had very well organized this attack, because they were able not to waste their javelins through the wall situation. I mean, even this idea of throwing them at the right moment, like when they were attacking the side of the flank, the flanks or the rear of the Spartan phalanx, and not just nervously throwing these javelins at the front. The men had been evidently instructed to do this, because the fact that the Spartans grew so exhausted and that the Athenians were pushing again, it means that the latter had been saving their ammo, essentially, and in a quite clever way. But now at this point, so at the end of this, when the Spartans retreated, the same Athenians couldn't push much harder, both because of the position the Spartans had retreated in, and also because they had partly lost their their javelins. By the way, the numbers of casualties the Spartans had undergone now also probably is a witness to this. I mean, the quantity of ammo that had been thrown. So here, quoting the Histories 36-38, it says, when it seemed there could be no end to this, the commander of the Messenians, the author Pausanias actually calls him common. Pausanias is another source of this. So these were the Messenians that had sided with the Athenians, and that were participating to the battle on Sphacteria. He went up to Cleon and Demosthenes and Demosthenes and told them they were wasting their time. But if they would give him a detachment of archers and Psiloi, he thought he could find a way to get round to the rear of the Spartan position and mount an attack from behind. He got the men he asked for and set off over ground that was out of sight of the enemy, so that they could not observe the movement. He worked his way around the steepest cliffs of the island at points where the Spartans, relying on the natural strength of their position, had placed no lookouts. It was difficult going, but Common just managed to get round undetected. His force suddenly appeared on the peak of the rear of the Spartans. They were thrown into panic by this shocking turn of events, but it was an excellent development for the Athenians, whose spirits were raised by the sight they had been waiting for. The Spartans were now under attack from front and rear, and were in the same dire situation to compare small things with great, as the men at Thermopylae. Just as those men were annihilated when the Persians outflanked them by taking that path, so these Spartans could not hold out any longer, caught as they were between two fires. They were few fighting many, and weakened by lack of food, and they began to give way, with the Athenians controlling every approach to their position. Cleon and Demosthenes realized that if the Spartans collapsed any further, they would be wiped out by their troops, and so they put up to stop to the fighting and held their men back. They wanted to deliver the Spartans to the Athenian people alive. They hoped that if the Spartans heard a herald's voice offering terms, it would break their will and persuade them lay down their weapons and accept their terrible predicament. So a herald proclaimed that they could, if they chose to, lay down their arms and surrender to the Athenians, who would then decide what to do next. When they heard this, most of the Spartans put down their shields and raised their hands to signal that they accepted the terms that had been offered. A truce was agreed, and Cleon and Demosthenes entered into discussion with Styphon, son of Pharex, representing the other side. Of the commanders appointed earlier in the first command, Epidatus was dead, while his chosen successor Epagretus had been laid among the corpses taken for dead but actually still just alive. Styphon had been selected as a third in succession to take command according to Spartan law should anything happen to the others. Styphon and those with him said that they wanted to send a herald across to the Spartans onto the mainland to ask for instructions, but the Athenians would not allow any of them to leave the island and called for heralds to be sent over from the mainland. After 2 or 3 exchanges, the last herald to make the crossing from the mainland brought this message: "The Spartans instruct you to decide for yourself what to do, as long as this is nothing dishonorable." After some discussion among themselves, they surrendered and gave up their arms. So here we have many. It's actually a long chunk but it's very interesting. So in the first part, we have seen essentially how the Athenians made it to attack the to get rid of the Spartan avant-post. This was actually pretty difficult to do because we've seen it was very well defended. Now, naturally, the Spartans were in a very serious situation. They couldn't last for long, definitely, but this would have entailed also partly for the Athenians to wait further. So there is this Messenian that, probably maybe knew already Sphacteria was part of his own land, etc. And he figured out this narrow passage around Mount Elias that the Spartans hadn't basically they weren't guarding because they thought that it was a their position was so strong. It says to citizens that they didn't care about it. Instead, basically, at this point, these you have to imagine the Athenians were still around the Spartan camp at this point, so they were still pushing. Also, were partly with the hoplites that had also landed, trying to assault. And during this assault of the fort, the how was his name? Common Messenian basically popped out of the even a higher ground from this narrow passage that overlooked the same Spartan camp. So this is interesting because there is the parallel that is made with the Thermopylae, and this is very interesting not just because of now the Spartans and the the parallelism between now fighting between the Persians and the Athenians, but it tells so much about ancient warfare because incidentally at the Battle of the Thermopylae in the 2nd century BC between the Romans and the Seleucids, it happened basically almost the same thing. That the Romans took up a horn of the Thermopylae, and just a few men that showed up there basically made collapse allegedly the whole Seleucid army because they thought to be surrounded. So this idea of picking up the higher ground and dominating from there was something devastating. And now the Spartans on the fort of Mount Elias were pressed from two fires. They're between two fires, and especially I think from this top position, Common could target the Spartan camp with javelins and other, even worse, with arrows and slings that had also a longer range. So basically at this point the Spartans decide to surrender because of this impossibility that they were exhausted probably, and the enemy now controlled even higher ground over their camp, so they were done for it. And it's very interesting because they also surrendered. The idea of surrendering here is very especially for the Spartans at this point, again, was something extremely they had been beaten, and beating the Spartans at this point, and Spartans Spartiates, it was something definitely that didn't happen every day. So you can imagine the enormous pride the Athenians took from this victory, even though it was achieved in kind of sneaky ways, because these were considered barbarian tactics in fact, and part of the reason why Spartans surrendered at this point was exactly because of this, that if they had been fighting against other hoplites, maybe they would have not surrendered. If they were fighting now against these skirmishers, they preferred to surrender, not to die by the hands of barbarian tactics, so not to suffer this shame. Relatively to the narrow path around Mount Elias, we don't have many certainties. There is an author that is Pritchett that in 1965 seemingly identified a narrow path along the that might have been the one used by common Messenians to get around the Spartan position. But I think there is not much of a certainty. Also, probably the ground changed a little bit in the millennia, so it's not really this important. Important is what we can get from this battle. So probably Common's troops were also very few. Probably, I don't know, a couple of tens of skirmishers might have been actually enough to make this finally the Spartan collapse, Spartan moral collapse, morale collapse. Sorry, and so at this point the Athenians had won. Spartans surrendered, and here Thucydides says history is 438-39. That day and the following night the Athenians kept the Spartans under guard. Next day, after setting up a trophy on the island, they made their preparations for sailing and distributed the prisoners among the Triremes for them to guard. The Spartans sent a herald and took off their head. The numbers killed and taken alive on the islands were as follows: 420 hoplites all crossed over. Of these, 292 were taken alive, and the rest were killed. The number of the Spartiates among the survivors was about 120. Not many Athenians were killed because the battle was not fought at close quarters. The men were blockaded on the island for a total of 72 days, from when they were stranded after a sea battle to the land battle on the island. For about 20 of these days, while the ambassadors were in Athens negotiating, they had received regular supplies. For the rest of the time, they had depended on what the blockade runners could bring in, and the Athenians collected up some grain and other food on the island. Epictetus, had issued rations to his men more sparingly than the level of supply actually permitted. So this is another bit of it. It's interesting because of the number of casualties that about which there is probably not much to add. Probably some 30 would have been killed in the first wave attack when on the southern Spartan outpost and during the landing. Another good 130 would have been killed during combat. And we can imagine also probably higher death rate among the Helots than the actually Spartan hoplites. So this was actually a very heavy defeat, actually, because there is only one battle into which such a high death rate, it was around 30% now, and happened. That was aside from the Battle of the Thermopylae, where the Spartans were actually massacred completely. There had been the same this same massacre, this same casualty rate had been suffered by the Athenians at the Battle of Aegyptium under Demosthenes' command, at the hands of the overwhelming numbers of the Aetolian javeliners. So here, even maybe up to a 40% of the 1600 hoplite force had been lost. This is very interesting because aside from the Thermopylae that obviously this terrain that basically bottled up the Spartans to be annihilated by the Persians, you see that these bloodsheds began to happen into Hellenic warfare exactly in this moment into which these new tactics were introduced. So, and by the way, you say, well, why didn't they resort to these tactics before? Well, it's also a matter of terrain. Because objectively the phalanx was fine as long as it fought in those open grounds where the Greeks usually set up for battle, also in a quite ritual fashion many ways. So this instead, you see, this Sphacteria ground was pretty pretty difficult as well, and these troops were counted best suited for the role. And also in the case of Aegyptium, it was essentially the Athenians fighting against the Aetolians that, they were still Greeks, but they were conceived as borderline, and they had a completely different society from the ones of Athens and Sparta. So this is a good lesson could be learned, generally speaking, in the history of Hellenic warfare and the importance of the war, the Peloponnesian War, because of its essentially expansion of the Hellenic borders outside the usual battlefields of the Hellenic motherland. And therefore the importance of this Psiloi, this ektromoi as well, among the hoplites were definitely the proof that even for such a bath of blood like Aegyptium and Sphacteria, definitely the Greeks were already kind of more aware of what was going on. I mean, the same Demosthenes and Cleon in this campaign showed that this idea of using the skirmishers so more extensively and differently from the usual traditional hoplitic tactics really was buzzing in their minds. So the point here is really, and there is also another point that is interesting, is actually how the Spartans were considered a bit like the epitome of Hellenic warfare, in the sense that they were the best hoplites that the Athenians hadn't dared to attack. Even now, when we were discussing for instance, the blockade on Pylos, that happened at the ends of the Spartans, the Athenians were many more than Spartans at a certain point. They didn't try to set forth to fight them, because they knew that, meeting the Spartans in open ground was the Athenians now were avoiding directly, because they knew they didn't have the same strengths and the same forces. So the fact that this also in here such a massive number of Spartans had been killed and captured as resorting to these tactics was definitely something that changed many things in the Hellenic mindset, showing that the best hoplites could be annihilated. Naturally, Sparta maintained its, aside from this defeat, I mean, this was not the end of Sparta. The end of Spartan supremacy would occur 50 years later with the Battle of Leuctra, with another tactics that relied mostly on actually masses of hoplites from the Thebans, but it still was a formidable opponent in open ground as a phalanx of hoplites. So this is very important, because there is a sort of barrier that was surpassed at this point, a mental block, like the idea of looking at the Spartans. They were the best, the undefeated, the greatest, but not really undefeated, but let's say this, the strongest hoplites, we could wipe them out in such a way that, and in fact I would like to conclude with the Histories 440 that state this very interesting words, that for the rest of the Greeks, this was the most unexpected event in the world war. And we're talking about Thucydides that wrote about the Peloponnesian War. They had never thought Spartans would lay down their armies as a result of starvation or under any other form of compulsion, but expected them to keep their weapons and fight on in a way that they could, in any way that they could, and die. They could not believe that the men would surrender with the same kind of men as those who had died. Later, one of the Athenian allies tauntingly asked one of the prisoners from the island whether his comrades who died were the fair and brave ones. The prisoner's answer was that a spindle, by which he meant an arrow, would indeed be worth a lot if it could pick out only the brave. His point was that it was a chance that determined who was killed by stones and arrows. So, I could add maybe some war, because actually there is so much to tell about the Peloponnesian War, but today I wanted just to analyze now this point. Pylos actually was held by the Athenians eventually, and they actually, the Athenians carried out the war at this point, even with this important whatever, this is another story. We'll leave it for another time. For now, I wanted to tell you about this, and I finally made it to make this video, and it's a very long one, so I'm sorry maybe for not being so speedy, but I wanted to get everything in detail, and I hope that I make maybe a couple of mistakes, but I corrected myself. So if you listen to the video, you hear the point when I do it, but there were details, actually the essentials. I was fine with having delivered them correctly, and so this is just one of the chapters we will analyze, and I won't add much else. I just hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.